Somewhere right now, a 22-year-old is explaining to her grandmother why she doesn't go to church anymore, and the grandmother is nodding politely, but she doesn't actually understand because when she was 22, not going to church wasn't a conversation you had, it was a scandal. It was the kind of thing that got you talked about at Sunday dinner when you weren't there, and now it's just Tuesday. Here's a number. In the early 1990s, around 90% of American adults identified as Christian. 90, that was not that long ago. That was your parents' generation, maybe your grandparents, depending on how old you are. In the early 1990s, up to 90% of American adults identified as Christian. By 2022, that number had dropped to about 60%. That's 30 points gone in roughly 3 decades. Now, here's where it gets genuinely strange. The Survey Center on American Life found that Gen Z had the highest rate of religious disaffiliation, 34%, compared to Americans as a whole, among whom 23% were unaffiliated on average. And more recent data pushes it even further. The percentage of young Americans who are religiously unaffiliated shifted from 38% in 2024 to 39% in 2025. A substantial 18% of Gen Z affirmatively identifies as either atheist or agnostic, a rate double that of earlier generations. Double? Not a slight uptick, double. And yet the question no one is asking correctly is why? Not morally, not spiritually. I'm not here to tell you what to believe. I'm here to tell you what's actually happening underneath the surface. Because the real answer is not young people are smarter now. It's not religion was always fake. And it's definitely not TikTok ruined everything. Those are all lazy explanations. The actual answer is a systems problem. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. We're going to explain how the trust machine works, why it's breaking down, and why Gen Z is the generation where the whole thing finally falls apart in a way no one inside the machine fully predicted. Let me introduce you to the machine. Every belief system, every ideology, every institution, every religion runs on the same infrastructure. I call it the trust machine. It doesn't matter if we're talking about Christianity, a government, a currency, a bank, or a corporation. The machine has the same basic parts. You have an input. People are born, raised, and socialized into a shared set of beliefs. You have a process. Those beliefs are reinforced through community, ritual, identity, and social consequence. And you have an output. Loyal members who reproduce the system by raising kids inside it, donating to it, defending it, and eventually dying inside it. That is a machine. It is not mystical. It is not evil. It is a social replication system. And for centuries, literally centuries, it worked extraordinarily well. The trust machine was basically self-sustaining. The only thing it needed to keep running was one critical input, children born into it. And that's exactly where it started to break. Because here's the thing people consistently get wrong about religious decline. They think the story is about belief. They think Gen Z looked at the evidence, weighed it rationally, and decided God doesn't exist. That's not what happened. Belief is downstream of something much more structural. Past studies suggested childhood religious socialization was the single biggest factor predicting adult affiliation. But the decline in religious affiliation that began with the baby boomers means that a smaller proportion of each subsequent generation is raising kids in religious homes. So the machine didn't break because the output changed, it broke because the input did. Fewer religious parents means fewer religious children. Fewer religious children means even fewer religious parents in the next cycle. You don't need apostasy, you don't need some dramatic cultural revolution. You just need the reproduction rate to dip below replacement, and then you wait 2 or 3 generations, which is exactly what happened. Among Generation Z, 43% who are now religiously unaffiliated report that they were raised in a non-religious household. 36% of unaffiliated millennials also report growing up non-religious. Fewer unaffiliated baby boomers grew up without religion, only 16%. Instead, the vast majority, 84% of unaffiliated baby boomers were raised religiously and have since left their childhood religion. Read that again slowly. For baby boomers, leaving religion was a rebellious act. For Gen Z, a massive chunk of them never had religion to leave. The machine never got them as inputs, so they didn't defect. They were just never customers to begin with. That is not a faith crisis, that is a supply chain failure. And supply chain failures compound. They don't just plateau, they accelerate, which is where we are now. Now, here's the first escalation, and it's one most people completely miss. The trust machine doesn't just need inputs, it needs the inputs to trust the machine itself. And trust, real, durable, institutional trust, has a very specific recipe. You need authority to appear competent. You need community to feel genuine. You need the costs of leaving to outweigh the benefits. And you need the outside world to look worse than the inside. When all four of those conditions are met, the machine hums. People stay, they invite others in, they defend it instinctively. Here's the problem. Gen Z grew up watching every single one of those conditions collapse simultaneously. Not one, not two, all four at the same time. Start with authority and competence. Gen Z entered the workforce with very different assumptions about institutions. They watched financial systems collapse without consequence. They saw corporations promise stability and deliver layoffs. They lived through a pandemic marked by contradictory leadership and shifting rules. Authority for them was not something that protected people, it was something that failed publicly. So when a religious institution stands up and says, "Trust us, we have the answers," Gen Z hears that through the same filter they use for every other authority, and the filter does not default to yes. As a result, Gen Z does not grant legitimacy automatically, they audit it. Emerging research shows that Generation Z are becoming one of the least trusting generations in modern US history. According to a major Gallup and Walton Family Foundation survey, Gen Z reports extremely low confidence and trust in almost every major institution connected to government and democracy. While older Americans have also seen a decline in trust, Gen Z's drop has been sharper than all other generations. The survey found that fewer than 1 in 6 Gen Z members trust Congress, the presidency, the news, or large tech companies. Fewer than 1 in 6. Now, you want to walk into that room and ask them to trust a 2,000-year-old institution? Based on what exactly? Based on authority. They don't trust authority. Based on community. We'll get to community. And based on tradition. Tradition is not a selling point to a generation that watched tradition protect predators for decades while victims were told to stay quiet. Because that's the other thing. The abuse scandals inside religious institutions, particularly in Catholicism, didn't just damage the credibility of those specific organizations, they contaminated the entire category. When people think large institution asking for unconditional trust, religion is now in the same mental bucket as probably hiding something. That's not rational or irrational, that's pattern recognition from a generation that grew up with information access. They didn't have to experience it directly, they watched it happen in real time with receipts. Here's the second condition the machine needs: community that feels genuine. And this one is genuinely tragic because community is actually the one thing Gen Z desperately wants. Nearly 1 in 3 Gen Z, 28%, reports always feeling lonely. Similarly, 1 in 4 Gen Z, 26%, consistently feels isolated compared to just 5% of elders. Key trends among Gen Z include rising anxiety, loneliness, self-doubt, and an increased desire for well-being and authentic connection, despite living in a digitally connected culture. So you'd think this is where religion wins, right? You'd think the loneliest generation in recorded history should be sprinting toward institutions built entirely around community. That's the obvious play. The demand is there, the product exists. Why isn't the transaction happening? And this is where it gets complicated. In Springtide's study on reconnecting America's loneliest generation, where more than 1,000 young people were surveyed and interviewed, 1 in 3 young people said they feel completely alone most of the time. 45% said they feel that no one understands them. 40% said they have no one to talk to and feel left out. Now, listen to this. Those who identified as religious or spiritual say their faith practices positively impacted their mental health. Those who claim to be very religious reported the highest rates of positive mental health. So the data says religion is good for mental health. The data says Gen Z is desperately lonely, and yet Gen Z is still leaving. That's not an irrational outcome, that's a market failure. That means the product is good, but the distribution is broken. The machine is producing something valuable and still losing customers because the interface is wrong, the branding is wrong, or the price in terms of identity, conformity, and social compliance is too high. The decline of institutional trust, the increase in demographic diversity, and the rise of social media, among other factors, mean that young people are operating in a different social environment than the one that gave rise to the successful program-driven models of youth engagement over the past 50 years. Churches built their community model for a world where people lived near each other, socialized in the same circles, and had limited access to alternative communities. That world is gone. Gen Z has access to infinite communities, infinitely filtered to their specific interests. If you are a 20-year-old who likes a very specific genre of music, you can find 5,000 people globally who share that interest, communicate with them daily, and build real relationships entirely outside geography. The local church, the neighborhood mosque, the synagogue down the street, they used to be the only game in town for belonging. They are no longer the only game in town. They're not even in the top five. That's the third condition failing. The cost of leaving has dropped to near zero. In previous generations, leaving your religion wasn't just a spiritual decision, it was a social suicide. You lost your network, you lost your marriage prospects. In many communities, you lost your job, your housing, your family relationships. The exit cost was catastrophic. So people stayed even when they privately disagreed, they attended without believing, they performed faith rather than losing everything attached to it. The machine retained them not through genuine conversion but through structural lock-in. Gen Z has, for the first time in human history, a genuine alternative ecosystem. You can build a full social life, friends, romantic prospects, professional networks, sense of purpose and community, entirely outside of organized religion. The lock-in is gone. And when you remove lock-in from any system, the people who are only there because of the lock-in leave. Always. That's not a religious phenomenon. That's a basic incentive structure responding to change conditions. If you are enjoying this kind of breakdown, where we pull apart how systems actually work instead of repeating what everyone already says, subscribe. I put out videos like this consistently and I don't water them down. Now here's the fourth condition. And this is the one that I think is the most underrated, the most important, and the one nobody in mainstream media is willing to say clearly. The machine needs the outside world to look worse than the inside. For most of human history, life outside a religious community was genuinely terrifying. Disease, poverty, social exclusion, violence. Religion didn't just offer community and meaning, it offered physical safety networks, almsgiving, hospitals, schools. The church was the welfare state before the welfare state existed. If you got sick, if you lost your harvest, if your husband died and left you with 4 children, the church was the only institution that might actually help you. Leaving wasn't just spiritually costly, it was materially suicidal. That contract has been replaced. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. We have secular education, we have social safety nets, we have public healthcare systems, imperfect as they are. We have secular charities, NGOs, online mutual aid networks. The church's monopoly on social services is gone. And with it goes one of the most powerful non-theological reasons to stay inside the machine. But here's where I want to go deeper because there's a layer underneath all of this that I think is genuinely counterintuitive. You think the problem is that religion is unappealing to Gen Z, but actually the problem is that religion is appealing to the wrong parts of Gen Z for the wrong reasons, and repelling the most important parts for structurally predictable reasons. Let me show you what I mean. The data on Gen Z and religion is not actually a simple story of everybody walking away uniformly. It's messier than that, and the messiness tells you a lot. The more significant religion story is that young women and young men are moving apart religiously, a divide that mirrors the broader gender gaps emerging among Gen Z across a wide range of political and cultural issues. Look at the numbers on this. The proportion of Americans ages 18 to 29 who identify as religiously unaffiliated has grown over the past decade from 32% in 2013 to 38% in 2024. However, this change is largely driven by young women. In 2024, 40% of women ages 18 to 29 identified as religiously unaffiliated, which represents an 11 percentage point increase from 29% in 2013. In comparison, the percentage of men ages 18 to 29 who identify as religiously unaffiliated remains stable, 35% in 2013 versus 36% in 2024. And it got more extreme after that. By 2024, that figure for young women grew to 40%, and in 2025, it increased to 43%. So young men's religious disaffiliation has been basically flat for over a decade. Young women's disaffiliation has gone vertical. What does that tell you? It tells you the machine is producing outputs that are structurally incompatible with what young women are willing to accept. And young women understand incentives very clearly. For the first time, more young women than men were disaffiliated from the religion in which they were raised. 54% of Gen Z adults who left were women and 46% were men. That study points to a few reasons. Nearly two-thirds of Gen Z women say churches do not treat men and women equally. Gen Z women have become far more politically liberal than their male peers and display a stronger feminist consciousness than older generations of American women. Many faith traditions, meanwhile, continue to uphold or even double down on complementarian theology, which preaches male headship in both church and home. Here's how I'd frame it as a system. Imagine you're a young woman in 2025, you're educated, You have career options your grandmother didn't have. You have a social network that validates your autonomy. And then someone tells you, join this institution, but understand that within it, your formal authority will always be subordinate to men. Your highest calling is defined as wife and mother. And the loudest voices in this community are going to spend significant energy telling you what you can and cannot do with your own body. What's the rational response? You do a cost benefit analysis, and the benefits don't clear the bar. So you leave, or more accurately, you never fully join. This is not a story about atheism, this is a story about incentive misalignment. The machine is offering a product that doesn't match the values of its most important demographic segment. And it's been doing it for long enough that the segment stopped knocking. Now, here's the thing about the men. Contrary to the conventional wisdom that younger men are being drawn to religion, the percentage of young men who identify as religiously unaffiliated has largely stayed the same since 2013, with 35% identifying as a nun in 2013 and 35% identifying as a nun in 2025. So the Gen Z men are returning to church narrative you've probably seen in the news. To be fair, the plateau in Gen Z men's religious disaffiliation is a notable story, especially given that for much of the past 2 decades, trend data have shown Americans increasingly shedding religious labels. Yet so far, we find no evidence that Gen Z men are actually becoming more religious. They're not coming back, they just stopped leaving at the same rate they were before. That's not a revival, that's a plateau. And even a plateau is still a floor, not a ceiling. But here's something genuinely interesting that I want to sit with for a moment. Because there's a subset of young men who are deliberately moving toward more rigid, demanding forms of religion, not the casual Sunday Christianity of their parents, not the comfortable, flexible, spiritual but not religious middle ground. They are gravitating toward orthodoxy, toward traditional Catholicism, toward Islam, toward forms of faith that ask a lot and give strict structure in return. When the Gen Zers turning to religion offer reasons why, they sound more like escapes from modern chaos than declarations of faith. Their newfound religiosity is less about belief than about orienting life around something ultimate, something greater than the self. That's a very specific psychological profile. And when I look at it through a systems lens, it makes complete sense. The isolation of the COVID-19 pandemic nudged more young men toward recognizing the need for purpose and community in their lives. And when you're drowning in optionality, when everything is available, nothing feels meaningful, every commitment feels reversible, a rigid structure becomes a feature, not a bug. The very demands of strict religious practice are the appeal. It is the opposite of modern life's infinite menu. But here's the catch, this trend is genuinely small. It's culturally visible because these converts are loud and online, but the numbers don't show a movement. What they show is a niche market. The trust machine overall is still losing output. It's just that a small minority of people are actually choosing to enter the machine voluntarily, as adults, which is a historically unusual phenomenon. Which brings me to the mini case study because I want to make this concrete. Let's build a fictional but realistic scenario. Call him Marcus. Marcus is 24, grew up in a moderately religious household in a mid-sized American city. His parents went to church on major holidays. They said grace at Thanksgiving. He went to Sunday school until he was about 12, then it kind of stopped being enforced. He absorbed the cultural identity of Christianity, the holidays, the language, the vague sense of moral framework, without the infrastructure of active religious community. Now he's 24, he lives in a city, he works in tech, his friend group is diverse in every conceivable way. He has access to therapy, to online communities, to political movements that give him meaning. None of his close friends are actively religious. When a difficult moment happens, a breakup, a job loss, a death in the family, the support structures that activate are his friends, maybe a therapist, online communities. The local church never enters the equation, not because he decided against it, because it was never a habit. The on-ramp simply doesn't exist in his daily life. This is not Marcus defecting from religion, this is Marcus existing in a world where the on-ramp was never built. His parents were inputs into a low-intensity version of the machine. The machine produced a low-intensity output. And low-intensity outputs don't reproduce the system. They produce children like Marcus who have no input at all. Now here's the economic math on what this means. As older cohorts of highly religious older people have passed away, they have been replaced by new cohorts of young adults who are less religious than their parents and grandparents before them. At a phase, each generation has become less religious as it has aged. Religious institutions in the United States collectively manage hundreds of billions of dollars in assets. real estate endowments, schools, hospitals, pension funds. The Catholic Church alone holds assets that analysts estimate in the hundreds of billions of dollars globally. These institutions were built and funded by generations of highly religious donors, people who tithed consistently, who left bequests, who showed up and gave. That donor base is aging and dying. And a replacement generation gives significantly less, shows up significantly less, and in enormous proportions, never shows up at all. If you modeled this as a business, it would be a company with rapidly aging customers, declining customer acquisition, and a product that 60% of new potential customers say they don't want. What happens to that company? It either radically reinvents itself, emerges and consolidates, or it slowly runs out of revenue and closes locations. We are watching all three of those things happen simultaneously in American Protestantism right now. Thousands of churches have closed in the last 2 decades. Denominations that were massive cultural forces in the 1980s, mainline Protestants, for instance, are running at fractions of their former size. And this is where the economic second order effect gets genuinely serious. Because when the machine loses volume, it doesn't just lose revenue, it loses the community infrastructure that communities depend on. The decline of religion has implications for American civic and social life as well. Religious Americans are generally more socially and civically active. The frequency of religious participation, not one's religious identity, appears to be the most important factor in determining the level of engagement in other social and civic activities. So here's what that means practically. Religious institutions have historically been the backbone of local volunteerism. Food banks, community support networks, after school programs, recovery groups, emergency housing. When you hollow out the institutions, you don't just lose the theology, you lose the civic infrastructure those institutions were quietly running in the background, and there's no obvious secular replacement at the same scale. The paradox is almost comedic. Gen Z is the loneliest generation in history. Studies show that youth ages 11 to 26 are part of the loneliest generation ever recorded. This is concerning because loneliness affects mental and physical well-being. A meta-analysis of studies on loneliness found that loneliness increases the odds of an earlier death by 45%, the same impact as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, and they are actively dismantling the primary historical infrastructure for human belonging. Not because they want to be alone, because they don't trust the institution packaging the belonging. It's like being severely dehydrated and refusing to drink the water because you don't trust the bottle design. That's not smart. That's also not stupid. That's a rational response to a world where the bottle has been contaminated before. Now, here's the part where you think you see where I'm going and you're wrong. You might be thinking, okay, so the takeaway is that religious institutions need to rebrand, modernize, become more inclusive, and they'll get Gen Z back. And some people are saying exactly that. Faith leaders can invest in building trust through authentic relationships with young people rather than relying on institutional authority to do the lifting. They can promote belonging to the same degree as believing. They can address the issues that young people care about, like racial and ethnic identity and mental health. That's not wrong exactly, but it misunderstands the depth of the structural problem. Because the trust machine doesn't just need a software update, it needs new hardware. And you can't install new hardware into a machine that was built for a different era while the machine is still running without breaking the parts that currently work. Here's what I mean. The sections of religious communities that are actually growing, or at minimum declining more slowly, tend to be the most demanding, most doctrinally rigid versions. It has long been the case that laxer forms of religion have declined while more demanding forms have grown, or at least declined more slowly. So the data says if you want to retain people, ask more of them, not less. High commitment creates high retention. But high commitment also drives away people who won't accept the specific demands being made, particularly on gender and sexuality. So you can't simultaneously be more inclusive and more demanding. Those two strategies produce opposite results. You pick one or you pick the other. And any organization that tries to do both ends up doing neither well, which is basically the story of mainline Protestantism in America since the 1980s. Meanwhile, look at this. Almost half of Gen Z claimed religion isn't important, a 15% increase from the 2014 survey. About a quarter of Gen Z respondents believe that religion does more harm than good. A quarter? That's not disinterest, that's active skepticism. That's a generation that has made an affirmative negative assessment. Getting from there to trust us, come to church is not a branding problem. That's a category problem. They don't think the product is bad for them the way you might think a particular brand of chips tastes bad. They think the product is bad for society. That is a much harder position to market your way out of. Look, here's something that I find genuinely interesting, and I want to be careful here because I'm not making a moral argument about whether any of this is good or bad. I'm making a structural argument. Religion survived and thrived for thousands of years across radically different societies, different economies, different technologies. It solved a very real set of human problems: meaning, mortality, community, morality, and cosmic framework. Those problems have not gone away. About 65% of Gen Z identifies as spiritual. The growth in spirituality is not only reflected in Gen Z, over 70% of millennials and 80% of both Gen the 10th and older generations claim spirituality. So the desire for something transcendent hasn't disappeared. What's disappeared is the willingness to get it through a specific institutional form with specific institutional costs. By picking and choosing their own beliefs, they embraced a spiritual salad bar approach rather than aligning themselves with a particular religion. And that's actually a profound economic shift. Gen Z is not anti spiritual, Gen Z is anti subscription. They'll take the individual features, the meditation, the meaning, the community, the ritual, the ethical framework, but they want to select them individually from multiple sources without committing to a full institutional package. That is a fundamentally different market behavior than any previous generation, and institutions built around mandatory full package subscription have no good answer for it. Now, let me give you a quick visual because I want you to stay with the machine metaphor. The trust machine has gears. You've got parental transmission, community reinforcement, institutional credibility, and exit cost. In the 1950s, all four gears were turning at full speed. In the 1990s, the parental transmission gear started slipping. In the 2000s, institutional credibility took a direct hit. In the 2010s, the exit cost gear fell off entirely because of social media alternatives. By the 2020s, the only gear still functioning reliably is community reinforcement, and that one's grinding because the supply of people to reinforce to is declining. A machine with one working gear is not a functional machine, it's just a noise. Alright, here's the third level of this, and this is where I want to talk about incentives in a way that I think will feel slightly uncomfortable to everyone, regardless of where they sit on this issue. Religious institutions, like all institutions, are run by humans, and humans respond to incentives. When the incentive is grow the community, serve the members, maintain trust, institutions behave in ways that serve their members. When the incentive shifts to preserve the institution at all costs, the behavior changes. You protect the brand, you suppress inconvenient information, you prioritize the survival of the organization over the well being of the individuals inside it. This is not unique to religion. This happens to every organization that gets large enough, old enough, and powerful enough that its self preservation instinct overrides its original mission. It happened to banks, it happened to governments, it happened to universities. The pattern is identical everywhere. The machine stops serving the people and starts serving itself. But here's why it hits religion harder than most. Because religion makes an extremely specific claim that other institutions don't make. It doesn't just claim to be competent. It doesn't just claim to be useful. It claims to be the authoritative source of absolute moral truth. That claim creates an impossibly high bar for credibility. When a bank behaves badly, we say, well, banks are corrupt. That's unfortunate but expected. When a religious institution behaves in ways that contradict its absolute moral authority, the damage is catastrophic. The entire value proposition collapses. Because if the institution claiming to speak for God is covering up abuse, is it speaking for God? Or is it speaking for the same self-interest that every other institution speaks for? Gen Z has access to information that answered that question in the worst possible way repeatedly across multiple denominations, multiple faiths, multiple countries, and they have the receipts. Harvard's researchers warn that this distrust extends beyond institutions to the social fabric itself. Many young Americans report avoiding political conversations for fear of backlash and doubt that people who disagree with them still want what is best for the country. In other words, the trust deficit isn't just toward religious institutions, it's toward shared reality itself. And a machine that runs on shared narrative, which is what religion fundamentally is, cannot function in an environment where shared narrative is impossible to sustain. The internet didn't just give people information, it gave everyone competing information, and you cannot build a coherent theological worldview when you are simultaneously exposed to every theological worldview that has ever existed, plus the full history of every institution's most embarrassing moments, plus algorithmic amplification of whatever content produces the strongest emotional reaction. Here's the comedic cutaway because we need it. Imagine a church marketing team in 2025. They've got a budget. They've got a social media manager. They're posting scripture quotes on Instagram with aesthetic fonts, and they're boosting posts to reach 18 to 24-year-olds. The algorithm looks at their content and says, okay, your target audience's interests are financial independence, anti-institutional skepticism, mental health, ironic humor, and identifying institutional hypocrisy. Let me show them your content about obedience. That'll land great. Target reached. Zero conversions. Okay, back to it. The fourth level, and this is the one that nobody seems to want to talk about because it implicates everyone on every side. The machine is not just losing because of its failures. It's losing because a replacement machine has been built, and the replacement machine is faster, more personalized, more emotionally responsive, and available at all times. That machine is the internet. Specifically, it's the creator economy, the influencer ecosystem, the online community structure, and I say this without moral judgment because this is literally what the data shows. The top 10 financial influencers have more than 6 times the followers of the top 10 financial institutions globally. Apply that same principle to spiritual and community content, and you understand the market shift. Gen Z is not walking away from meaning making. They are getting meaning from podcasters, YouTubers, online communities, political movements, wellness culture, and self-help ecosystems. They are still getting something that functions like theology, a coherent story about who they are, what's wrong with the world, and what to do about it. They're just getting it from Joe Rogan, from Reddit, from a fitness influencer who talks about discipline and purpose, from a political movement that offers enemies and belonging in equal measure. And look, some of those alternatives are genuinely good, some are genuinely terrible, but the machine doesn't care which ones are good. The machine only responds to what's producing the outputs. And right now, the secular meaning making infrastructure is producing outputs at a scale and efficiency that traditional religious institutions cannot match, because traditional institutions are built for a world with no competitors. The 2008 financial crisis, climate inaction, pandemic mismanagement, mass surveillance scandals, and persistent misinformation in legacy media have painted a picture of institutions that are opaque, unreliable, and self-interested. To Gen Z, these entities often appear more concerned with preserving power than protecting the public. In contrast, influencers seem accessible, relatable, and human. That's the key word, human. A 25-year-old on YouTube who talks about their doubts, their mistakes, their search for meaning, that's a person. A centuries-old institution with a formal hierarchy and a press office is not a person. And in a trust environment as broken as this one, people trust people before they trust systems. The Harvard Youth Poll finds a generation defined by economic insecurity, deep anxiety about the future, and a corrosive distrust of the institutions that are supposed to help them thrive. For Gen Z and young millennials, instability is not a passing phase of early adulthood, but the organizing principle of daily life. And here's where I come back to the machine metaphor one more time. For the final piece, I said earlier the machine has 4 gears: parental transmission, community reinforcement, institutional credibility, and exit cost. 3 of the 4 are broken for the majority of Gen Z. But there's a 5th gear I haven't mentioned because it's the one that could theoretically save the whole thing. It's called personal revelation. It's the gear that runs on genuine individual spiritual experience. The kind that doesn't depend on an institution, doesn't depend on parental transmission, doesn't depend on social lock-in. It's the person who has a real felt encounter with something they describe as transcendent, and it reorganizes their entire life. This is what the Gen Z religious revival conversation is actually pointing at, even if most of the reporting on it is statistically shaky. Because there are genuine anecdotal accounts of young people raised in secular households with no religious background encountering something in moments of personal crisis, in brushes with mortality, in periods of extreme loneliness, and walking into a church or a mosque or a synagogue and staying, not because of the institution, despite the institution, because the gear that doesn't need any of the broken infrastructure still works. That this gear is rare, it is not a movement, it is not reversing trends. It seems that revival in the first sense of a numerical growth of people who identify as Christian or attend church is not happening. While some samples show young adults increasingly expressing a commitment to Jesus, Gen Z is increasingly likely to not identify with any religion at all. The personal revelation gear can produce individual converts. It cannot by itself rebuild a machine. Machines require systematic replicable processes. Individual revelations are by definition not that. For lasting stability to take hold in US religion, something would need to change. Gen Z would have to become more religious as they age, or future generations would have to be more religious. But if the religiousness of future generations looks more like Gen Z than Gen the 10th, then we can expect a long-term decline in religion. Look, here's the second comedic cutaway. There's a type of person who reads all this data and says, see, this proves that Gen Z will come back to religion when they have kids and realize they need community and values. And in their head, they have a very clear image of a late 20s couple holding a baby, quietly rediscovering faith. And to be fair, life events do cause some people to re-engage. But the data on Gen Z parenting is that they are having fewer children than any previous generation at older ages in lower rates of marriage. So the mechanism that was supposed to bring them back, the kids, is arriving later in smaller numbers into households that are already secular. The comeback mechanism is operating at reduced capacity. The numbers don't support the narrative. And now here is the part where I actually tell you what this means in practical terms. Not for religion, not for society in the abstract, for you. We've been running this whole analysis through the trust machine, and I want to now use that machine to tell you three things, three actual takeaways that aren't be spiritual or question authority or other things you already know. The first one is this. The same forces that are dismantling the religious trust machine are operating on every other institutional trust machine simultaneously. The generation that stopped trusting the church, stopped trusting the university at the same rate, stopped trusting the government, stopped trusting traditional financial institutions. Confidence in the United States government has fallen to one of the lowest levels among wealthy nations, with less than a third of Americans under 30 expressing trust in public institutions. This means that every sector that runs on institutional trust is experiencing the same structural deterioration. Healthcare, finance, media, education. If you are building a career or a business or an investment thesis, you need to understand that the trust machine for large institutions is in long-term decline. That is not a temporary dip, that is a structural shift. The winners in the next economy are going to be whoever can deliver the outputs people actually want. Community meaning security, guidance, through models that don't require institutional trust. Small, transparent, personal, verifiable. That's the direction of travel. The second takeaway, lock-in is disappearing everywhere, not just in religion. Historically, lock-in was how every dominant player in every industry maintained market position. Your bank had lock-in because switching was painful. Your employer had lock-in because leaving meant losing benefits and starting over. Your ISP, your cable provider, your religion, all maintained position through switching costs, not through genuine value delivery. Gen Z, specifically because they grew up in a digital environment where switching costs are near zero, has a fundamentally different relationship with every commitment. Employment tenure is shorter, subscriptions are cancelled more freely, brand loyalty is weaker, relationships are re-evaluated more continuously. This is not because Gen Z is uncommitted, it's because they are operating rationally in a world where the switching cost has been engineered out. If your business model, your investment thesis, or your career strategy depends on lock-in holding, you should be nervous. Build around genuine value delivery instead, because lock-in as a moat is deteriorating across every domain at the same rate and for the same reasons it's deteriorating in organized religion. The third takeaway, and this one is the most counterintuitive, loneliness is an enormous economic opportunity. I don't mean that callously, I mean that Gen Z's priorities are clear. Being happy tops the list at 65%, followed by financial stability at 53%, and having good mental and emotional health at 49%. The demand for belonging, for meaning, for genuine community is at a generational high. The supply of high quality, trustworthy, low commitment community infrastructure is at a generational low. That gap between desperate demand and collapsing supply is where markets get made. The businesses, communities, and models that figure out how to deliver genuine belonging without requiring full package ideological subscription, without the institutional baggage, without the exit cost and conformity pressure, those are going to be extraordinarily valuable. People will pay enormous amounts financially and with their time for a place where they actually feel like they belong. That is not a soft observation, that is an economic fact. And the generation that needs it most is the same generation that is most suspicious of the institutions historically providing it. Whoever solves that problem wins. And on that note, the trust machine keeps running. Just slower every year for the institutions that built it, and maybe faster eventually for whoever replaces them. If you haven't subscribed, do it. This channel doesn't repeat what everyone else is saying.